Chosen one, listen carefully, because something you have felt happening for a long time, something you could sense but could never quite prove, finally reached its answer today. This is not a story. This is not something crafted to make you feel better before another difficult family gathering. This is a spiritual account of what happens when someone deliberately works to turn the people who share your blood against you, and heaven finally allows the truth of what she has been doing to arrive exactly where it needed to land. Her judgment has arrived, not as punishment invented out of nowhere, but as the natural, inevitable consequence of a pattern she built for far too long, believing no one would ever trace it back to her. You may have felt something shift earlier today without knowing exactly why, a sudden, unexplainable lightness settling over you in the middle of an ordinary task, as though a weight you had carried so long, you had almost stopped noticing it had quietly begun to lift. A family member's name crossing your mind unexpectedly, followed by a strange sense that something concerning them had just occurred, a calm you could not quite explain, arriving in a season that has otherwise felt tense every time family was mentioned. None of that was your imagination working overtime. It was the ripple of something shifting in a place you could not yet see, reaching your spirit before it ever reached your understanding. You know exactly who I'm talking about. You have watched her operate in rooms full of people who love you, always careful, always subtle, never saying anything so obviously cruel that anyone could call it out directly. A comment here, framed as concern. A story there, slightly reshaped to cast you in a worse light than the truth would have allowed. A pattern of being just kind enough to your face that no one would believe you if you tried to explain what she was actually doing behind it. You have watched relationships that used to be warm toward you grow cooler over time, watched invitations become less frequent, watched the tone in certain rooms shift the moment you walked in. And you have known, somewhere deep inside, that this did not happen naturally. It was cultivated, carefully, deliberately by someone who understood exactly how to reshape a family's perception of you without ever leaving fingerprints obvious enough to be traced. I want you to understand something important before we go any further, because it will change how you carry the next part of this message. What she did to you is one of the most painful forms of harm a person can experience, precisely because it does not attack you directly. It attacks the people around you first, poisoning their perception slowly enough that by the time you notice the distance, you cannot always point to a single moment that caused it. This is why you have felt so powerless in this situation. You were never fighting one conversation. You were fighting a slow erosion built over months or years, one small comment at a time, until an entire family's posture toward you had shifted without a single dramatic confrontation ever taking place. That kind of harm is difficult to defend against, because defending against it requires proving a pattern, and patterns are notoriously hard to prove to people who only witness the individual pieces, carefully spaced apart, never all at once. Here is what you need to understand about the way heaven responds to this particular kind of harm. It does not always intervene the moment the first comment is made, because a single comment rarely reveals a pattern clearly enough for anyone to recognize what is actually happening. Heaven allows the pattern to continue long enough that when it finally breaks into the open, there can be no mistaking it for an isolated misunderstanding. That is the cost of waiting for undeniable clarity instead of a quick, ambiguous correction, and I know that cost has been heavy for you to carry. But today, the pattern became undeniable, in a way that even the family members most reluctant to believe you could no longer explain away. Think about the specific moments that led to today. The subtle way she always managed to be the one delivering news about you, positioning herself as the trusted source before you ever had the chance to speak for yourself. The way she would express concern about you in front of others, using language that sounded caring on the surface but planted doubt underneath it. The kind of doubt that lingers even after the conversation ends. The way certain family members started treating routine things you did, things you had always done without controversy, as somehow suspicious or self-serving, once she had spent enough time reframing your character in their minds. Each of those moments, small on their own, was building towards something, and today that something finally became visible enough that it could no longer be dismissed as your imagination or oversensitivity. Before I tell you exactly what happened today, I want you to do something small but important. If your spirit recognizes even a fragment of what I'm describing, if you have felt a family slowly turned against you by someone working carefully in the background, type 777 in the comments right now as your declaration that you receive this word. Like this video so it reaches someone else today who has been quietly grieving relationships that changed without explanation. Share it with someone who has felt isolated within their own family by a pattern they could sense but never fully prove. And subscribe, because what happened today is only the beginning of what is about to be restored in the seasons ahead. Now, let me take you back to where this actually began, to understand why someone would work this deliberately to isolate you from your own family. We have to look past the behavior itself and into the place it was born from. Because this kind of manipulation rarely comes from simple dislike. It comes, almost always, from a deep insecurity about her own position. A fear that if the family truly saw both of you clearly, side by side, without her carefully managed narrative shaping the comparison, she would not come out ahead. Rather than working to become someone more secure in her own right, she chose the easier, more destructive path of diminishing you instead, calculating, whether consciously or not, that the family's affection was not infinite, and that every bit of warmth directed toward you was somehow warmth taken away from her. Every time you were mentioned with admiration, something in her quietly recalculated how to reframe it before it could settle. Every time a family member leaned on you for support instead of her, something in her treated it as a loss to be corrected, rather than simply the natural rhythm of different relationships within the same family. Every time you succeeded at something without her involvement, something in her needed to find the angle, the caveat, the subtle reframe that would keep your success from becoming a threat to whatever position she had built for herself within that family system. This is how quiet insecurity becomes deliberate manipulation over time. It does not begin with a plan to destroy someone. It begins with a fear the person refuses to examine honestly, and eventually that fear demands a strategy, and isolating you from the family became her strategy, whether she ever admitted that to herself or not. Notice how carefully she chose her targets within the family, always starting with whoever seemed most receptive to concern, most easily positioned as an ally rather than a witness. She did not need everyone to turn against you at once. She only needed a few key relationships reshaped first, because once a few people began treating you with subtle suspicion, it became easier to convince others that something must genuinely be wrong, since surely so many people could not be mistaken at once. This is how isolation spreads through a family system, not through one dramatic announcement, but through a slow, patient recruitment of doubt, one relationship at a time, until the doubt itself began to feel like consensus rather than the manufactured pattern it actually was. C.S. Lewis wrote about a particular kind of corruption that grows not through dramatic evil, but through the accumulation of small, self-serving choices a person makes to protect their own comfort at someone else's expense. He observed that this kind of person often does not see themselves as cruel at all. They see themselves as simply managing a difficult situation, protecting their own position, doing what felt necessary given the circumstances as they understood them. That self-perception is precisely what allowed her to continue this pattern for as long as she did without ever confronting the harm she was causing. She was not necessarily lying awake at night plotting your isolation with full awareness of what she was doing. She was, more likely, quietly justifying each small choice as reasonable, one at a time, until the cumulative effect became something far more damaging than any single choice would have suggested on its own. Scripture speaks plainly to the danger of this kind of quiet, ongoing deception. Proverbs describes the one who sows discord among family members as someone whose actions heaven specifically takes note of, listed among the things that are described as detestable precisely because of the damage they cause to relationships meant to be a source of strength and belonging. This is not a small offense treated lightly. Family is meant to be one of the safest structures a person has in this life, and deliberately corrupting that structure for personal advantage is treated with a seriousness that matches the depth of harm it causes. What she has been doing was never simply interpersonal friction. It was the deliberate corruption of something sacred, and heaven does not overlook that kind of corruption indefinitely. With this understood, we can move into what actually happened today. Because this is where the story turns, and this is where you finally see exactly how her carefully managed narrative began coming undone. Today, in a moment she did not orchestrate and could not control. Two pieces of her carefully separated stories finally met in the same room. A family member who had heard one version of events from her directly compared notes, almost by accident, with another family member who had witnessed something entirely different with their own eyes. The comparison was not dramatic. No one shouted. No one staged an intervention. It was simply a quiet, ordinary conversation in which someone said, almost casually, something that did not match what the other person had been told, and in that small, unremarkable moment, the careful architecture she had built over months finally showed its first visible crack. You can imagine the particular quality of that moment, even without having witnessed it yourself. The brief pause in conversation when both people realized their versions did not line up. The slightly confused look exchanged between them, neither one initially suspecting deception, simply noticing an inconsistency worth clarifying. The gentle, almost innocent question that followed, not accusatory, just curious. Wait, that is not what I heard. And the quiet unraveling that began the moment that question was asked out loud, instead of being quietly dismissed the way similar doubts had been dismissed so many times before. That crack did not stay small for long. Once one inconsistency became visible, the family members involved began doing something they had not thought to do before, quietly comparing other stories she had told them, other concerns she had raised, other moments of doubt she had planted about you over time. And as they compared notes, a pattern that had been invisible when experienced individually became unmistakable when finally laid side by side. This is not you needing to defend yourself or produce evidence of your own. It is simply what happens when a narrative built on selective truth finally meets people willing to ask the same questions of each other that they never thought to ask before. By the time the conversation ended today, something had shifted permanently in how those family members understood the distance that had grown between you and them. They did not need a full confession from her to recognize what had actually been happening. They simply needed to see the inconsistencies laid next to each other, and the pattern spoke for itself in a way that no explanation from you ever could have accomplished nearly as convincingly. Word of this quiet realization is already beginning to move through the same family channels where her carefully managed narrative once traveled so effectively, except now it is carrying something entirely different. A growing understanding of how the distance actually happened, and who was responsible for engineering it. In the days ahead, you may notice a shift in how certain family members approach you, hesitant at first, perhaps a little embarrassed about how easily they were led to believe a version of you that was never accurate. Give them room for that hesitation. It is not easy to admit you were manipulated, even when the manipulation becomes obvious in hindsight, and some will need time to fully reconcile what they now understand with how they have treated you over recent months. You may also notice her becoming noticeably more careful, more guarded, aware now that the stories she once told so freely are being quietly cross-checked in ways they never were before. This shift did not require you to expose her yourself. It simply required truth to finally be given the room to compare itself against itself. Watch for small gestures that mean more than they might seem to on the surface. An unexpected phone call from a family member who has been distant for months, with no explanation offered for the sudden reach out. Simply a quiet return to normal contact, as though the distance is being allowed to dissolve on its own terms. An invitation to something you would not have been included in a few weeks ago. A shift in tone during a group conversation, warmer than it has been in a long while. Even if no one directly references why, none of these moments need to be forced into an explicit conversation about what happened. Let them simply be received as what they are. Quiet evidence that the truth is doing exactly what truth eventually does when it is finally given room to breathe. I want to caution you here, because this is exactly the moment when people in your position often undo the very restoration that has just begun quietly unfolding. You may feel the urge to make sure every family member fully understands everything she did, to lay out the entire pattern in detail so that no one could ever be confused about it again. I understand that urge, especially after carrying this alone for so long, but hear this clearly. You do not need to complete the work heaven has already started. Let the family members who are recognizing the pattern arrive at their own conclusions in their own time, at their own pace, without you needing to narrate every detail for them. Over-explaining here can sometimes shift sympathy in unhelpful directions, making the conversation about your need to be believed, rather than about the truth that is already becoming clear on its own. Let your steadiness be the loudest thing about you in this season. Nothing restores trust faster than watching someone remain calm and gracious, while the truth quietly does its own work around them. With the reversal now understood, we can move into what this means for you specifically, because this was never only about her judgment arriving. It was also about the restoration that is now becoming possible within a family structure that had been quietly damaged for far too long. what you walked through.
The confusion of watching relationships change without explanation. The loneliness of being misunderstood by people who were supposed to know you best. The discipline of not retaliating even when every part of you wanted to correct the record loudly. None of that was wasted. It was forming in you a patience and integrity that will now serve as the foundation for whatever rebuilding takes place next. There is a real difference between a family relationship rebuilt on a quick, surface-level apology and one rebuilt because the people involved took the time to genuinely reckon with what actually happened. What is unfolding now has the potential to become the second kind, deeper and more honest than what existed even before she began her interference. If everyone involved is willing to do the harder work of full understanding rather than a quick return to comfortable silence. I want to address something directly before we continue, because it will try to whisper the moment this video ends and the ordinary noise of tomorrow returns. A voice will suggest that all of this was too convenient, too easily applied to anyone listening, too neat a resolution to be specifically about your own family. Recognize that voice for what it is. It is not careful reasoning weighing the evidence fairly. It is the same old fear that has always tried to convince people their restoration was too good to be real the moment it finally started arriving. Doubt about this confirmation will not come with proof. It will come with noise, loud enough to drown out the quiet recognition you felt today when you understood what was actually happening. Trust what's settled in your spirit in the stillness over whatever tries to argue against it tomorrow, especially if she attempts to explain away what surfaced today as a simple misunderstanding. This season is asking 3 things of you now, and none of them are complicated, though all of them require discipline. The first is grace instead of an insistence on being fully vindicated by everyone at once. Some family members will come around faster than others, and forcing the timeline will only create new resistance where patience would have eventually produced genuine understanding. The second is discernment about how quickly to fully reopen relationships that were damaged. Trust rebuilt too quickly, without any acknowledgement of what happened, tends to remain fragile in ways that eventually resurface. Allow enough honest conversation to occur that what gets rebuilt is sturdy rather than simply convenient. The third is protection of your peace, regardless of how she responds moving forward. Whether she owns what she did or continues to deny it, your peace cannot depend on her accountability. It must be rooted somewhere steadier than her willingness to change. There is also a shift worth making in how you pray about her. If you have been praying about her at all beyond your own pain, it is natural to want her fully exposed, publicly, undeniably, so that every family member understands exactly what she did without any ambiguity left. There is nothing shameful in wanting that. But there is a deeper prayer available to you now, one that moves beyond wanting her caught and toward wanting whatever insecurity drove this behavior to actually be healed rather than simply punished. Pray for the fear underneath her manipulation to finally be addressed, rather than left to find some new outlet once this particular strategy has stopped working. This kind of prayer does something valuable in you as much as in her. It protects you from becoming someone who quietly celebrates another person's downfall, and it keeps the door open for genuine reconciliation if she chooses to walk through it honestly rather than defensively. Understand also that family restoration, when it is genuine, rarely happens all at once. Some relationships will heal quickly, almost as soon as the truth becomes clear. Others will take longer, weighed down by years of accumulated small moments that cannot be undone by a single realization. However significant, be patient with the family members who need more time. Their hesitation does not mean they still doubt you. It often simply means they are still processing how thoroughly they were led astray. And that processing deserves the same grace you would want extended to yourself if the roles were reversed. With the call to grace now given, we move into the final part of this message, the part that is less about understanding what happened and more about receiving it fully into your own spirit, so it becomes something that steadies you rather than something you simply heard once and set aside. Let this be a moment of quiet surrender. Heavenly Father, thank you for seeing every quiet moment. I carried the confusion and loneliness of watching my own family grow distant without fully understanding why. Thank you for allowing the truth to surface in your timing rather than mine, even though the waiting cost me relationships I valued deeply. Today, what was hidden began coming into the light, and I release any desire in me to turn that exposure into a weapon against her or into a tool to force every family member to see things exactly as I see them on my own timeline.
Forgive me for the bitterness that quietly took root during the seasons when I felt most isolated, and heal whatever wound in me still flinches at family gatherings.
Still braces for distance where there should only be warmth. Continue exposing whatever still needs to come into the light within this family, gently where gentleness will do the deeper work, clearly where clarity is what protects the people I love from continuing to be misled. Guard my heart from bitterness as relationships slowly rebuild, and guard my tongue from turning every conversation into an opportunity to relitigate what has already been resolved in the spirit, even if it has not yet been fully resolved in every relationship. Teach me patience with family members who need more time to fully reconcile what they now understand, and give me discernment about which relationships are ready to be rebuilt quickly, and which ones need slower, steadier care. And for her, Lord, I ask not for her ruin, but for her healing, that whatever fear drove her to do this would finally be met with something more transformative than exposure alone, so that this pattern does not simply move on to find a new target once this one has stopped working. Heal the specific ache I carry around the holidays and gatherings that were quietly poisoned by this season, so that I can walk back into those spaces without bracing myself for distance that no longer needs to be there. Where I have unconsciously started keeping score, tracking who believed her and who did not, soften that instinct in me, because family healed by grace will always be more durable than family reassembled by scorekeeping. I declare that the truth about who I am within my own family was never dependent on how successfully she managed to reshape it. I declare that my patience through this season of isolation was never weakness, and heaven has honored the trust it represented. I declare that what was hidden about her manipulation could not stay hidden forever, and I release any need to force further exposure beyond what has already surfaced naturally. I declare that I will meet this restoration with grace, rather than an insistence on immediate, complete vindication from everyone at once. I declare that I forgive her, not because what she did was acceptable, but because carrying resentment into rebuilt family relationships would poison the very restoration I have been praying for. I declare that this season of isolation has taught me a discernment about people and patterns that I will carry into every relationship going forward. I declare that my family's love for me was never actually gone, only temporarily clouded in clouds. Unlike character, do not last forever. I receive this confirmation fully, and I choose to walk forward in patience instead of urgency, in openness instead of guardedness, in peace instead of the bitterness that could so easily have taken root here instead. If this message reached something true in your spirit, type 777 in the comments as your declaration that you receive it. Like this video so it reaches someone else today who has felt quietly isolated within their own family by a pattern they could sense but never fully prove. Share it with someone who has stayed graceful through family distance they did not create and could not fully explain. And subscribe, because there is more still unfolding in this season. And you will want to be here for what heaven reveals next as this restoration continues to unfold. What was hidden within your family could not hide forever, and what you carried faithfully through the isolation is only just beginning to be understood for what it truly was all along.